all been there. But I have a lot of things in my head from drawing out of doors, making lots of paintings over a long career, and so there's rather a vocabulary in my head that I've learned. I do find that if you spend a lot of time outside drawing, you learn a great number of forms. And even if you no longer have the drawings, if you have sat there for half an hour or an hour, you've probably learned the forms and they're inside your head. You may not think so, but they're there. So what I'm going to start with is a particularly lovely brush, which is old. You're told never to use your brushes down to this level. This is as hard as a rock, and I use it to draw with. It's not unlike drawing with a stick. This is liquid. This is Rembrandt Burnt Umber. This is Rembrandt Ultramarine. I use them to make a grisaille underdrawing, and I'm able to take the two colors and mix them together to make something reasonably neutral, or if I want to go warmer or cooler at a certain stage, I can stress one or the other of the colors. So, I think we'll start with a mountain or a hill. One of the things you might want to think about when you bring a line over to the side or the edge of the canvas is not to have too dramatically falling a line so the picture doesn't seem to fall out or quit just before it gets to the edge. That was easy enough, right? Those of you who are actually painting, feel free to do that and we'll check your work afterwards. When I do this, mountains that are very far away will give you a silhouette that's as sharp as that. Mountains that are closer to you, you still have a sense of their form. So what I often do, and you might find handy, is that I give these some sort of a contour so that I remember, in fact, that they're also coming towards me. So there we have a mountain coming towards us. I'd like that to be a little bit higher up. So one of the choices perhaps is to give another range behind it or just increase its height, and I think I'll increase its height. Well, this could be some kind of a local feature wherever this is, and they're famous for being the twin mountains that have the same silhouette. We'll see what happens with that. So right about there I want some feature, so I just make some marks. I think that the ground plane distances be around in here. One of the things I like about this sort of brush is that it's long ago given up the ghost, and so it doesn't make a smooth line, and I get rather a staccato line, which enables me to have little breaks in it and make it slightly more interesting. I think because we have this strong diagonal thrust this way, I think we want to have something coming this way. So here's an intermediate hill for you. So this line I probably won't pay much attention to ultimately. I have very much enjoyed painting in Ireland, and so there's a little bit of Ireland in my head at the moment. Here I want something that's going counter to this line. If by this stage you think I know what I'm painting, I don't. That's an important thing, and I like to keep the whole thing fluid as long as I possibly can. For this water, which it might be, this road, which it might be, I need to have this sit on a plane, so this little hill has got to stop somehow behind it. It's happened to me many times in dealing with galleries that someone will come into the gallery and say, "Oh, I know just where that is." And I smile to myself because I don't even know where it is. And then they'll tell the dealer where that place is located. It's very near their house, wherever they live. Someone else will come in and say, "Oh, I know where that is." And it'll be an entirely different place. And of course, neither of them can be right because I've made it up. But what I think happens is that I think people react, in fact, to the quality of the light. They've seen that light a million times in their lives. And if there's a truth in it, it is in fact what they're recognizing. But it would not occur to most people to think, "Oh, I recognize the light in that." So they assume that it must be the topography of the place. I paint this same way when I paint out of doors, and which I do a little bit during the year, and I always, of course, am doing during workshops. But even when I'm outside, I spend a lot of time rearranging what's in front of me. I said in the interview yesterday that there are few instances where Mother Nature does a great job of composing things. And part of our job is to help her be a little more organized. So now we have lots of possible planes there. Not sure I like the shape of this line. So I think we're going to go up a little bit higher there. And I'm going to change that and maybe have another rank of things behind this near one. Some of my students know about a man named Johansen. And Johansen is a man whose house often appears in my work. There is no real Johansen. And he's somebody who picks up his house and moves it with great regularity. And what Johansen is about is that often I'll make a spot of something way out here to be a destination for the viewer's eye. And it's usually a little square of a light color, and so it has become Johansen's house. I think that's going to be a little bit of cliff back there. Remember, all those brushes that you've worn down like this are your friends. This is not a rosemary brush because I wouldn't treat a rosemary brush like that. Now, if we are in Ireland, then these hills are going to be largely bare. We're not going to have a lot of trees in this landscape. I'm just now making planes. I sometimes make up a narrative while I'm speaking, which will surprise you having heard about Johansen. That is some sort of something, because I like that shape, and I will ultimately give a justification, I hope. It's possible that if this is a river, that along the edge there is some sort of a track. You know about lost and found edges probably. It's often a good idea with a line like this, if you're going to have a road, to then have it disappear and reappear. So it goes there, and maybe that's, we can't quite see it, but maybe there's a little sandy beach there. And in fact, maybe the road reappears out here someplace. And viewers like taking something like this and connecting it to the other one. This doesn't look so much like a road now, it looks like a line, but it might look more like a road ultimately. This could be a flat sandy bank, let's say. But I think maybe we want to have a little bit of erosion here, so we'll have a little bit of a something like that, that is where the real land begins. something I asked to be reminded to tell you, and now I've remembered it myself. And that is that when I started painting, I really didn't have any instruction. And I was working in a lumber yard, and I was trying very hard to avoid being an artist because everybody told me that I was going to starve to death. One of the interesting things was that I was starving to death in the lumber yard, so I'm not sure what difference it made. But my boss was fired, and he was fired for a political reason within the company. And I said, well, that's just terrible. There's no way I can work for this company. And so I quit. And I was really quitting to paint, but I couldn't say that to myself because I didn't have any money in the bank. I barely knew how to paint. But I could quit on principle, which seemed very high-minded, so I did. And this was one particular Labor Day, and I managed to get the local art association to say I could have a show on a Friday night, the Friday night after Thanksgiving, and the Saturday day. And so then I had, you know, almost 2 months to paint a show, and all I had to do was learn how to paint in the meantime. My suggestion to you would be, if you wait until you have all of the skills and you have a lot of money in the bank, I hope you enjoy the job you're working in the meantime. Sometimes you just have to take a big gulp and do it. Even though I called it something else, I sort of knew what I was doing. Anyway, the show came, and a lot of the customers in the lumber yard were New York weekenders, and they came out and supported the show, and it sold out. That's exciting until you realize the most expensive thing was probably $50, and it was in a, no doubt, in a frame that I had bought at a garage sale. The painting probably was larger, and the frame was a certain size, so I just made it fit the frame. But in any event, that's how it started, and that was a long time ago now, and I haven't had a grown-up job since then. And of course, the longer you don't have a grown-up job, the less likely you are to want to go back and have one. So I sort of had to learn how to do this. The problem was, at that time, pre-internet, for me to find who it was I might learn from was just about impossible. So I found that I had to largely teach myself. And I did that by collecting a lot of art books to the extent that I could afford them, going to museums, and trying to take the paintings apart from the surface back, which was very hard because I didn't have a lot of skills, and so I wasn't entirely sure exactly what I was looking at. So I made a bunch of Hudson River School sort of paintings because that's where I lived at the time, and they were certainly not great, but they encouraged me enough, and I got to a certain stage where I did one that was somewhat larger, and I then gave myself a diploma, and I didn't have to do that anymore. Painting really tightly and in the style that perhaps had nothing to do with my time turned out not to be congenial for me. I didn't draw very well, and so I learned a kind of brushwork that is somewhat abbreviated. I learned to let certain kinds of marks stand for things rather than necessarily painting all the leaves on a bush or something like that. And I found that if I gave just enough information, the viewer would look at it and say, okay, I'm willing to accept that that's a bush. So then the viewer and I had a compact together to make this painting and to then believe in it. It sounds kind of funny, but people really want to be involved in it. Very often when paintings are absolutely perfect, they make the viewer stand back, admire the skill, but feel that they're not part of the process. And for me, the viewer being part of the process is important. Also, when I started, I wanted to be John Singer Sargent. I'm sure some of you know about that. And one of the things I eventually realized that the difference between Sargent and me was less what he was able to do with his hands, though I couldn't do that, but it was that he thought about things in a very different way than I did. Because I tend to be very controlled in the way I paint, even though it may not look like it at the end, his ability to paint and just go bleh with some paint was something I tremendously admired, but it wasn't part of my personality. And it took me a long time to keep myself from being upset that I couldn't paint like Sargent and realize my job was to paint like me. And that's a real important thing to do when you're first starting. All those painters that you admire are very often painters who don't in fact paint the way you do, or maybe sometimes the way you should. And you mustn't beat yourself up about the fact that you can't be this person or that. I would have equally been happy to be Sorolla or Anders Zorn, but again, it was a kind of brushwork that I don't do. It wasn't really congenial with my personality. You might wonder what that is. That's a big brown section. I'm just trying to get a little bit of value on these things. And you can see those contour lines will start to go away because the liquid will melt them. My people at Rosemary Brushes should not see me doing this with this brush. But I'm very tough on brushes. I have found that the ivory brushes by Rosemary are a lot more durable than others, and so they put up with this for longer than many others that I have used. You can hear the brush protesting. I also squint a great deal, and so that means that I don't have to walk back quite as far to see what the overall look is. I hadn't painted out of doors in some years, and I went to this place to paint, and I was used to exactly the distance between my easel and the coffee table in front of my couch, and so I would stop within 2 millimeters of it automatically. So I was out painting out of doors, and there was this big rock behind me, and I backed up and fell right over the rock, and I was somewhat embarrassed, but nobody else was there, so that was good. So I moved my easel a little bit to the side, and then about 20 minutes later I did the exact same thing. So learn your distance to where you hurt yourself. I'm just trying to get a flat bit of value in here without distinguishing the values so much one from the other. I'm not sure how this bush has managed to stay here, given the fact that sometimes this river must be in flood, but we'll leave it there for now. You can see here I'm disregarding what I did behind it because I have another idea. Not sure I like the coincidence between this apex and those high points. I'll be thinking about that. Don't like this. This is that falling line I was talking to you about. So that's going to have to be. You can't tell when you're watching this, but in fact there are people here, and they're being very respectful, which is the first time they've done that since I arrived on Thursday. I know some of them are snickering, but I don't think you're supposed to hear them snickering. I did a class in two classes in late August and up to mid-September. There were 6 classes each, and they were at night. Two different classes on the same subject, which was painting from imagination. And I was quite surprised and very pleased that both the classes filled up, because I know for people who haven't done that, it's about the scariest thing you can imagine. A number of these people painted from photographs, generally, particularly in the wintertime. And the idea of not having the information was pretty difficult. The first time we had the class, I brought in some snippets from a couple of, I guess 3 different poems, and asked them to take some portion of the poem, and these poems were largely descriptive, and see what it suggested to them. And people made very interesting things, especially from the same sources. The next class, they had to paint from memory their childhood backyard. And at least in my case, when I was little, I knew my backyard. I knew every inch of it. And it was interesting to watch people try and bring that memory back. Another class, their canvases were this size, I think, and they were divided in quarters. And I asked them to bring a photograph to paint from. Anybody who knows me, I think, knows that I just don't permit that sort of thing. But anyway, so they were all excited to bring their photographs, and they brought their photographs, and I had them divide their canvas. And in the top left, I had them paint in 45 minutes a version of the photograph. And they thought, well, this is a piece of cake. We got all the information, we can do that. And then I had them paint the same scene in the other 3 seasons. And of course, they didn't have those photographs. So there was a little bit of dismay. And yet people then began thinking about how would this look like under snow, or what would it look like with autumn leaves. And people did great jobs. In this whole workshop, were there any great paintings made? No. Were there people who managed to stretch so much they couldn't believe that they could do this, and all of a sudden they found they could do it? And that's an exciting thing if you're the instructor, watching light bulbs go on over people's heads. Down here someplace, it's going to be where the reflection of that mountain is. So we'll put a little bit of color in there for now, just to be that. This water generally goes sideways, and so why I'm doing vertical brushstrokes, I don't know, but it will all come well at the end, I hope. for the moment, let's think that that water is reasonably still. So we can have, whoops, that's a little darker than I wanted. We can have an underplane for this tree and a little sense of its reflection. I don't want this really to be about that bush, so I'm going to take a little paper towel and give it a top, which will help. I paint a lot with paper towel, by the way. You can almost draw with it. I am famous for being a big fan of Scott towel, and I am because it's not terribly absorbent and it's rather scratchy, and it makes a nice thing to draw with. Don't like that line, so I think that we need to have a farther hill. So this is going to be ultramarine with a little bit of whatever's left from that brown-blue mixture. And there's going to be something up here. Here at East Oaks, I'm in a nest of figure painters, and something I don't do well. And I think I became a landscape painter because if you make trees, within reason you can put the limbs anywhere. And that people are so fussy about wanting arms to be attached to shoulders and things like that. It seems an unnecessary conceit to me, but this all starts pretty far away from us, so I wonder what we'll do about that. Let's get a little more color in here. I am somebody who is a big fan of the old remark that values do all the work and color gets the credit. And I think that's really true, and I think it's partly because when I was little, a lot of art books only had black and white illustrations in them. And if they were well drawn and well composed, you knew exactly what it looked like. It may be partly because at that time, too, most of television was in black and white, and so you had to figure out the color yourself. And you didn't really so much think about it until you'd seen things in color television and then thought, oh, there's something lacking here. But in fact, if you look now back at old black and white films, the way they're composed and orchestrated in black and white is peculiar to black and white, and sometimes when they're colorized, they're nowhere near as exciting because they were meant to be seen in black and white. So you can see that I still keep playing with this, with the shapes. So something has to be happening within this mass. So if we had a treasure hunt and part of your job was to go find this place, you could find it from a grisaille because the shapes would tell you where it was, and color wouldn't necessarily very much play into your recognizing the place. I think we want a little bit of an arc coming this way, so we're going to bring this down. Not quite sure what that's going to be, but more than anything, I'm erasing the lines that were there. Not so many trees in Ireland of the hills, but I think we're going to have a few. Would rarely be that big because the wind and the weather would not have permitted it. We'll go back to this, to our stick. When I put these things in, I don't know necessarily what they are. The river is going to be back here as well. And it's the bush that's going to interrupt our sense of the flow. Again, some contour lines just to give me a shape of what's happening. That's something reflecting in the water. This reminds me that it's water, so I don't go ahead and start making a road because I forgot what it was. Something's got to happen down here. One of the things that I like is to make a check mark, so essentially a flat mark like that, with one long side and one short side. It's a way of keeping pictures from falling out in the corner. So let's, I think that's where that special bush was that you were waiting for me to put in. It's going to be there somehow. It's going to cut off this line. Many of you know that I've never done a filmed or a live demonstration. there are always students there, and I have to remember that the fact that you're not saying anything is because I can't hear you. But it would be very curious to hear whether or not you've already said that I have lost my mind. I promise I haven't. So compositionally, I want some kind of a destination out here. I don't want it to be at the level of the river. I want it to be slightly higher. I think we'll have some sort of cottage. It's a good idea if you're going to make a cottage to have the pitch of the front and the back of the roof the same. A fault I often have. Something around in here would be nice. Let's change that line a little bit. This panel is a little unfair to my Edge Pro easel because it's very thick, and so it has a lot of weight in it, which is why this moves just a little bit. But if I were painting on a stretch canvas or on a thinner panel, that would not be happening. So. I generally move all this stuff around, not terribly committed to any of it. In some part, I'll begin to believe, and then I'll be really willing to believe that maybe I can convince somebody else that that's what something is.
Say there's 5 minutes till I got some questions.
Sure, good. Do I have to be here for that?
Ideally, yeah.
I'm looking to make sure that I have a swing around there, like that. So some of these little things I'm modifying are just to make sure I have that. When I make these marks, I'm not necessarily drawing anything in particular. I just want a certain value there for the moment, and later on I'll figure out what that's going to be. This thing, for example, seems unlikely at that size and at that distance, but I wanted something that was reasonably strong to anchor that. So afterwards we'll make it into something. Well, the cottage is leaving, I'm sorry to tell you. May reappear someplace else. It's never a good idea to get too invested in anything in my picture till I'm quite far into it, because I'm very likely to send it away. Something of interest over here might be a good idea. Good.
Okay, so we've got a couple of questions. So,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
first one from Sarah Brown. She says she really loves how you use natural and architectural elements to create depth. Could you please explain your thought process when designing this? Is your mind and techniques in your mind and techniques to bring this sense of depth to fruition?
Well, we know that perspective and recession, forms getting smaller, going away, will give us some sense of depth. In one sense, I start with lines and now I'm trying to make form. And how big the aspects of each one of the forms are will give us some sense of the depth of it. The place itself is still sort of evolving in my mind. Something just now has happened, late breaking news, that the water's going to go over here. This happens sometimes when there are floods, and there just seems to have been one. I like that better. Sarah, I don't know really what the answer to your question is. It's the size of marks. It's trying to get some sense of recession. Later on there'll be a little bit of a color temperature shift so that things will get bluer or at least slightly more neutral as they go away. The things up closer will have a little bit more detail in them. I never put in a lot of detail, but there will be relative detail. I don't know if that answers the question.
Second question is from Laurie Hallowell. She says, this is beautiful to watch. I can't imagine being able to make up a landscape this way. Could you talk more about how you began to paint from imagination and how long you painted from life before you were able to do so? Thank you very much for sharing so much.
Well, you're very welcome. As I said, when I first started, I had no idea what I was doing, and I didn't have a kit that I could take outside. I had hardly any kit at all, but so I would go out and draw, and then I'd try to come back and paint the thing that I had drawn, and it just was worthless. I couldn't do it. So the only way I was going to come up with enough paintings for that impromptu show was to complete the paintings from imagination. Well, all of us, some of you have not had your eyes open as long as I have, but all of us have had our eyes open long enough to have seen a great number of things. And if, while we're driving along or doing whatever, we are storing information, even without knowing it, you can tap this information and it's all in there. I may have seen some places in the world that you haven't seen, but you've certainly seen enough of the world to actually paint the world if you'll only allow yourself the freedom to say, yes, I can do this. It is so much about accepting that you can do it, and yes, it's hard, but once you do start doing it, it's probably the greatest freedom. For a number of years in the late 90s and early 2000s, would go to France twice a year just to draw. All I had was a folding camp stool, a pencil sharpener, B pencils, heaven forbid I should have more than one grade of pencils, and I would just sit down all day long and draw, and I'd move on to some other place. I rarely knew where I was going to have dinner, and as a consequence very often I didn't have dinner, but I would fill sketchbooks, and in the doing of it I learned a vocabulary that doesn't have to be French, but it tells me something about the way trees are made or the way buildings are made. And yes, we might have a different shape in Holland than we have in France or someplace else. Nonetheless, they are pretty simple shapes that we can understand pretty easily. So in the doing all of this, I did subsequently paint from some of the drawings, but more importantly, in the doing of it, I learned a lot about form, and I tried to store it up here so that I would have that information subsequently when I need it. So I don't know if that helps, but anyway, I painted outside in the beginning and did it so badly that I thought this is not the road to my salvation. It was worse because people could actually check whether or not I'd done it right, which didn't seem fair. And there are always people who want to know that you've done it right. But paint outside as much as you can. Don't be dismayed by what the result is on your canvas. Think about what you may have learned in the doing of it, and that's the real takeaway from it. I mean, we all paint a lot of really awful paintings, and they may seem to be a leap for us at the time, but when we look back several years later, you say, oh God, that's awful. But I did learn about this or that, or how water moves in that kind of a space. So it's really just keeping your eyes open, paying attention, working outside as much as you can. I really like painting in the studio now because I often paint very large paintings, and it's just not practical to paint those out of doors. And I want the light to be consistent over a period of time, which of course it won't be outside. And if I'm painting in my studio, my inspiration stays the same the whole time. It's also very convenient to my couch and my CDs and my books and coffee. There's a lot to be said for painting landscapes indoors. Okay?
Yeah. Another question is from Hong Yang, who says, as a student, how does one improve one's ability to capture the quality of light? Do you do quick outdoor colour studies, master copies, etc.?
I've only done a couple of master copies, and they were not landscape. One was a Franz Hals picture of a young woman, and I didn't do it too badly. I only did it in grisaille, thinking it was pretty good, but I couldn't do the mouth. And so I wiped the mouth off, and so she has stayed in my studio, and she's rather become a mascot for me. And she's become funny because I look at it and there is no mouth in this thing, and I remember my mother saying to me, wipe that smile off your face, which I think has to be the subject of this Franz Hals portrait that didn't work. The color studies, certainly, if you can do it, you probably have more skill right now than I had when I was starting. So I was having enough trouble getting everything to lie down in the landscape in grisaille or in monochrome. And color, it just so confused me that I couldn't bear it. And right now, you'll see that I'm developing this pretty far in grisaille. And it's because in the beginning, since I was unsure of all of my techniques, I tried to divide the job up into manageable bites. So if I could get the drawing right, I didn't have to worry about color coming in and being rambunctious and saying, oh, look at me, instead of, is that in the right place? Hi, I'm yellow. And that's not good, for me anyway. If you can keep all the balls in the air, then you certainly should. And color studies are good because then you're not looking to have some finished masterpiece. So I would suggest that if you can do that, you should do that. Most important of all, you should just draw, draw, draw. When I was making all of those drawings in France, they rarely had weather in them. They rarely had time of day. They were mostly about the structure of the land and the trees. So that when I brought them back, if I did look at them, if I wanted to make it moonlight, I wasn't already so confused by the fact that it had been sunlight or it had been an overcast day and you couldn't see the moon or whatever, that I could start from scratch and make it whatever I wanted it to be. It sounds like it's harder than it really is. I think that's probably all I can say on that.
A couple more questions. From Bruce Erickson. I kind of think you were just about to go into this, or you just touched on it a bit in that answer, which was how much of a sense of final colours do you have at this stage?
At this stage, I start to think about what the mood of the picture is going to be. I don't know that I know the colors. I want this to be reasonably, I don't think the word is dreary, but I think I don't want it to be a bright sunny day at this stage. I think that an awful lot of people don't paint overcast days, which I love in terms of paintings. Maybe because they are so much more about values. But at this stage, I don't quite know what this is going to be, though it's unlikely. It seems likely to me that it's going to be a blue sky.
Another question from MJD. That's what the name we've got. This is fascinating to watch. When do you consider the light time of day and season? Does it just evolve over time as you're painting, or do you have that in mind when you start?
Well, as you know, I didn't know the subject, so I probably didn't know that either. And I can promise you this time I don't know. As it goes along, I'll just begin to get it. Something will resonate with me and I'll say, oh, well, that looks sort of like it's whatever. And I'll take that as the starting point and then try to make everything else consonant with that. But I don't yet know. That's why you have to come back tomorrow. Actually, you'll get to come back. You can see some of it today, but as a special treat for you. This has already changed a lot. I think it may have changed countries even. Let's see. Do you have any more questions I can't answer, Joe?
That's it.
Okay. People who have been my students know that to expect me to know what I'm doing at this stage is much too early. Which is fine. The bad part is when I'm near the end and it's not clear what I'm doing. Were I outside, this liquid would already be setting up, and I wouldn't be able to push it around quite like this. remember this bush which was near the beginning? It's leaving. I rarely get paint on myself, and I even more rarely get it on my clothes. And people said to me, how does that happen? And I said, well, when I was first starting, paint was so expensive that one of the first lessons I learned was that you should never put paint any place where you're not going to be paid for it. So on your blue jeans probably is not a good place for your expensive cadmium colors. You may wonder what I'm doing now. I'm just trying to make a place. Just the littlest bit of the paper towel on here will show a change in plane. Maybe that was the original bush. Anyway, it's staying for the moment. Remember that reflections are also subject to perspective. So in flat water, if you're close to the same height as the water, the reflection is going to grow larger as it comes towards you. And all this stuff is not about painting, it's about keeping your eyes open when you're outside. I did a very large demonstration. It was 60 by 40 inches, so it's 150 by 100 centimeters. And it was for half artists, half people who were just interested in the arts, who didn't necessarily know much about painting. And I made something up, and it was 3 classes, 3 Friday mornings from 9 to 12. And the first week I largely did an Italian landscape. And then I decided I didn't like it very much, and so I made it ultimately into a sort of Bierstadtian version of a Hudson River School painting. And it was very difficult, particularly for the non-artists, because they were so invested in this Italian landscape and all of a sudden it was gone. But you need to be able to be flexible. You see things and go from there. When I was doing this, what I was seeing here was that this was some kind of a bush that didn't really mind the water very much, or being at the edge of it. But in my head, it was filled with springtime foliage. So that's what that is in my head right now. And make a mark up here that ultimately might be a road. That's too wide, but it's a way of my continuing the thrust of this water, which must be flat, into something up there. It may just be some part where the ground is eroded and there's a lighter part of just soil or rock or something. If we're in Ireland, these hills are covered with gorse and heather, and it's a very rough, not terribly high covering, but there are a bazillion colors in it. Here where I'm staying with everybody at East Oaks, I know there is some Guinness. And one wonders if that would help this. That would probably help my part of it, maybe not your understanding it. So that is a body of water, whether or not you're willing to believe it. So here I am erasing again with paper towel. Also, if I do it right, I can get some accidental texture just by the random movement of the Scott towel, so that it looks as though it's got some sort of surface to it. Even if it's not terribly bright, the top edge of this hill is going to be lighter than the side of the other hill coming down behind it. So we'll give it a little bit of form. Don't know what happens in here. Perhaps somehow there's a glen back there that I can't see. I know at least one person is watching from County Mayo, but I'm not picking up the signals. This brush doesn't have anything on it, so as you can see, it manages to get a little activity in that space that is somewhat random, but just so that I don't have a flat color there. Even if this is reasonably light at the top, since it's against the sky, it's going to have an edge. before I get into color, I'll obviously clean this all off. In the studio, I have a palette that's glass and it's 36 inches square, and so I don't necessarily have to stop to clean it. But in this case, and when I'm painting on plein air, I try very hard to remind myself to clean it, lest I drag all of this color into some fresh color I'm trying to make. I don't like this shape too much. I wanted something here, but I don't much like that, so I'll get a value in it and then think about the shape. It's probably not that so much that I don't like that, but I don't like the transition between it and the space behind it. So let's give some shape to that thing. You'll already know, if you didn't know my work ahead of time, seeing how I paint this, why I can't be Sargent. And I probably use as much paint on a canvas as Sargent uses on one hand. But I like to keep it thin, and when I was starting, I really had no instruction, and so as long as I could keep it in steps and not commit myself too much, I was okay. As soon as I put a lot of paint on it, I would get lost immediately. I think sometimes when you're learning, you don't realize that the people whose work you happen to be liking went through exactly the same things that you're going through, because you only see them coming out the other side, in some cases, or not coming out the other side. Difference between what I'm doing here and what my studio practice is, right now I would probably go make myself a cup of coffee, sit down and stare at it for a while. You would find that less than entertaining if I did that, so I'm going to keep going. But it's certainly important to step back. Make sure there isn't a rock behind you, but step back and stare at it for a while. I don't like this shape so much. That's a little better, but this is a little hard over here, so I'm going to make that come down a little bit. By the way, there are more people here than you think there are, even though they're being as quiet as mice. You would have thought, however, that one of them would have heard me with my plea for coffee, but nothing happened. And you'll notice now, since it's really quiet, that nothing continues to happen.
You've got a wish.
I hope so. Are we an hour in yet, Joe?
Yeah, you're an hour and 15 minutes.
Oh, look at that. In that case, it's definitely coffee time.
It's 2:15.
Uh-huh. So let's think about the fact that this could now be any time of the night or day. We could make this a mass that doesn't actually have leaves, it's just a thicket of twigs. So there's nothing in here right now that tells us that it has to be a particular season or a particular time of day. But we have begun to make what is, to me at least, a believable place. So as I have said before, and I said in the free interview yesterday on Facebook, that for me, the landscape and the topography of it, unless it's a commission, is not terribly important. What I like to do is to make something like this that I think of as an armature on which I'm then going to hang light. So once I begin to believe in the place, then I can begin to think about under what conditions I would like to see it. I have a number of times in my career made up a place and painted it in more than one season, or painted it in more than one time of day, and it's become as real to me as places that I've actually been. That is a famous bush called a no-name bush, which part of it looks like it must be a conifer, but I don't think that's what it is. Again, it's holding the place for something. What's interesting is if we're standing on the same level that this bush is, then we are above this river. And it's then curious where the river goes in front of us. So we might have to think about that a little bit. One of the problems of not having an audience, I can't say to you, okay, do you believe that? Because I can't hear you answering me. So I'm going to, pardon me?
I believe it.
Oh good, I'm glad you believe it, that's good. It looks just like that place you've never seen, right? Alex, could you deliver that for me over there? Thank you. Thank you. Joe, you should tell me when you get the first question that's, or the first remark that says, "I don't actually believe that place." Mm-hmm. Okay.
We've had a lot of them.
I'm sure. And you're just trying to not hurt my feelings, right? All right. So, do you have any more questions now?
We do have a couple, yeah.
Okay, because I'm going to set out some stuff on the palette and clean this up, so I can do that while you're talking.
I'm just going to mic myself off.
Okay.
You can hear me, so just one second. Good reason why I'm in there.
There it is.
We're live now again.
Okay. Thank you.
Divya, can you hear me?
So I'm going to start to put out some color. One of the things that is essential, I think, when you work out of doors, especially if you use a lot of colors, which I do, is that you always put them in the same place, so that you can automatically go to it rather than saying which of those dark colors is the dark color I want. You, I think, all have the palette list that I brought along with me. I am not remotely restrained in terms of the colors I use and the number of colors I'm willing to have, except for cadmium green light from Old Holland. I don't use any cadmium colors. That starts because in the beginning they were too expensive, and then it became clear to me from what people said that I was going to kill myself if I didn't clean up my palette and mind myself. But the real reason is, particularly for painting outside, there's a very limited amount of space on this palette. And I found that, at least in the beginning, and maybe it would be true now, that those colors, by the time I tamed them, I didn't have any room left on the palette. So then I'd wind up dragging colors back through all of this other mess and wound up with a lot of mud of high intensity. I've just put out now a Rembrandt color called Brownish Matter. It's number 324. It changes its name from time to time. It was called Permanent Brown Matter. I think it may now be back to it. For a while it was called brownish matter. But anyway, it's number 324. And it's a warmer version of alizarin. It's one of my favorite colors. It's one of the ones that I try to insist that people bring when they come to a workshop. Sometimes people find it hard to buy Rembrandt colors in various places in Europe, and so Rembrandt or Talens has been very helpful at times with sending me some color for these people, which is nice. The color I'm going to use at the moment is a Winsor Newton Prussian green, and it is able to be used transparently, as is the brownish matter. So what I can do is I can leave some of the underneath marks there and drag this over as a veil. Were I doing this with more time to dry, then I probably would let this grisaille dry, and then I would put this over the top as a glaze. But we're going to see if I can do it while it's wet. I don't think I can, but we'll see. Certainly.
So a question from Lynn Butcher. She's asking if you invent this much while painting outside or paint what is in front of him, or combination.
I would think, Lynn, that it's a combination. I have been heard to say that Mother Nature doesn't compose things very well, and that is entirely true. But also there may be some particular aspect of the landscape in front of me that I want to stress, and part of it I just want to lose. So I'm not terribly serious unless it's a commission about painting exactly what's in front of me. Generally, if I'm in a workshop situation outside and there are students there, I explain why I'm making this particular choice. Okay?
Oh, okay. You're okay.
Okay. Well, in one sense. This is brownish matter, the sort of more maroon version of alizarin, but I'm using it very thinly. I'm barely touching this canvas because I don't want to disturb all of those grisaille marks. I want them to give the suggestion of texture that I have carefully painted, when in fact I'm just covering over reasonably random marks. But they'll give a sense that there's more depth in what I've just done, or so I think.
It's not a question as such, but Leslie Hawes has basically just said she no longer feels guilty about painting with stick brushes and paper towels, which I thought was quite funny. That's all for now in terms of questions.
I believe from Arizona.
Okay.
I think it was Leslie who we talked about doing a workshop where she lives, and I like doing workshops, but I hate organizing them. And so if someone says to me, hey, I've got 10 people who want to do a workshop, will you come here? And I say, when? When do you want me there? But I hate making them up and doing them. I'm doing a workshop in Tuscany in October, which I think is full, though I'm not sure. But Todd Bonita of the Ogunquit Summer School of Art is organizing that, and it's great for me because I just have to appear. I get cranky if someone says, well, yes, we want to come and we'd like a better fare on the flight. However, we want to go to Verona first for 10 days and afterwards we're going to go to Istanbul. Can you figure that out? And I don't think I can. I think it's just too much for me. But if anybody wants me to come to wherever, Duluth, wherever, I'm there if you get me enough students. I generally even behave. These colors are coming along because we very often get these sort of tints, both in Ireland and in Scotland. painting this thinly over those marks obviously is much easier if it's dry. There are people whispering in this room. It reminds me of being in school and the teacher saying, "Donald, speak up. Tell the children what you were saying." And of course I never wanted to because it was usually about the teacher. Tomorrow, two friends are coming to be here live, both of whom have a tendency to heckle me. Knowing that, I still invited them to come. It's possible that you'll hear me invite them to leave. We'll see how they behave. This Prussian green is, in fact, quite a dark color, but it doesn't have a lot of pigment in it, which is part of what I like. I find that I could do the same thing with sap, but it has such a definite hue to it that it's not always appropriate. I have a particular Irish friend who, if she is listening, should tell you that she said to me the other night that I should, because I'm partly Irish, that I should not have quite so much blather. So I'm trying to give you less blather than I might. Tomorrow will be much more direct painting with opaque color, because this will all be dry then. But I'm still trying to make the place that I'm willing to believe in, or more appropriately, trying to get you to believe in. When I was first starting, I had an almost antique Volvo station wagon, and I took out the front passenger seat so that I could then sit in the back seat and set up my French half box where the passenger seat wasn't paint from the car in the wintertime. And so the local paper decided that they were going to do an article on me, and the article part was fine. Unfortunately, they chose a bad name for the article, and the article came out with this banner headline that said, "Doing it in the back seat," which was not something I wanted them to do. Not long after I'd had my several months of learning how to paint, I was at a dinner party, and I mentioned that a number of 19th century painters got their start by being sent to Europe in exchange ultimately for some paintings done while they were there when they returned. And at that stage, particularly, this particular man was in Ohio, there was not a lot of, let's say, serious painting to be found. So this was a tremendous opportunity for anybody who got this. And so I happened to mention this, and the next day I got a call from this guy and said, well, if you want to go, I'll take a commission. And I thought, that's cool. And then over a period of about 2 weeks, I wound up with commissions for 15 of these paintings. But the problem was that I had no idea what I was going to paint. And for them, they really had no idea what I was going to paint. So the deal was that they would pay 2/3 of what these paintings would cost if they were all done and they got to see them in a gallery. And I could paint what I liked, and at the end, these would be shared out. So I went and painted, and I was a reasonably young man, and this was a lot of money to me. So I went to Europe for 3 months to do this, and for 2 months I had the most wonderful time. And then in the 3rd month, I painted all the paintings, which seemed to me, at that stage, I thought to myself, no, why should I have to do that? I'm having a wonderful time. But I realized that people were going to expect something. And so when I get back and I have all these paintings, there was an event set up so that people could come see the paintings, and that's when the choosing would happen. So it seemed the fairest way is everybody got to choose a number from a hat, and this number, in fact, was the order in which they were going to buy their paintings. I chose for a friend of mine who was not there, and I chose number 13 of the 15. And I learned an important thing then, and that's that by the time we got to number 13, and it was my turn to choose for him, the one he liked best was still available. And often the painting that you don't think is your best that's in the show or will not be the most popular, in fact, really is. And we're often not at all the best judges of our own work. It's really nice to get someone, particularly early in your career, whose judgment you trust. You can ask serious questions and expect to get a serious answer. If you find somebody like that, do not let them get away. Because of that experience, and another one much more recently, in 2015, an old client of mine from whom I had not heard in a long time sent me an email and said, how would you like to go paint in Ireland for 3 weeks at my expense? And of course I had to think that over, but I agreed. And all of my trip was paid for, and at the end, and I could paint whatever I liked, go wherever I wanted. And at the end, he bought all the paintings, as well as a couple of larger ones that came from that information. So when you have experiences like that, and my original one of going to Europe for those commissions, you realize that there are people who are willing to give you a hand, and that they are the real angels in our profession. And I like to think that people will come along. I don't know why I think that they will come along, but I do. And in my case, they have. Though in the very first time, I didn't think anybody would come along. But anyway, I started a thing called the Traveling Fellowship. And every year, the Traveling Fellowship awards a $5,000 grant on the 1st of February for an artist to go paint and travel in Europe during that calendar year. This year's was won by Irvin Rodriguez, who you can find on Instagram. Irvin is I-R-V-I-N. The year before by Spencer Simmons, before that by Martin Dimitrov. And these people have had just wonderful experiences. And I would certainly recommend all of you to apply for this. It's not expensive to apply in this. It needs some images. You have to write a little bit, but there's not a lot. But it's the kind of opportunity that I wanted to make just because opportunities were given to me. I'm pretty sure if you're in Arizona you may not win next year, because in the first 2 years that we did it, both the artists came from Arizona and they lived about 15 miles apart. So I think Arizona's had its opportunity for the moment, but if you're really good, you might still get it. We don't get anywhere near as many applications as you would think, and your chances are much greater than you might suppose. The applications have to be in by December 15th, so that gives you lots of time, even if you haven't yet even painted the pictures you want us to look at. It's not limited to people with already highly developed skill, though we expect some skill. Mostly what we look for is we look at painters and try and find a painter who is in fact also an artist, not just a craftsman. And this tends to be the sort of person we want to foster. So in Ireland, sure, you get those rusty colors, don't you? I have no idea what that is. It looks sort of like it's a wagon filled with hay. It surely can't be that. That was the bush, I think. So let's get some water behind it there, or at least fix its shape. This end of the brush is one of my favorites, because I can actually scratch in here with it, make those a little more architectural. Then I can remind myself that maybe this water is going to have a little bit of movement in it, so I can just go like that to it. Joe, maybe you could play Danny Boy for me? Mm-hmm. Or you could sing it, right? That apparently was a no. I can't sing for you, or I would do it. In so much of Ireland, particularly where I was most recently in County Mayo, there is such an austere beauty to it. It's very subtle. Big forms with all these very subtle colors on top of them, and I react very strongly to that. I don't know if I have said in this broadcast that about a quote from Herman Melville in the beginning of Moby Dick, but he says, "It's not down on any map, true places never are." And I think that we can tell a truth in making up places that is just as valid as paintings of real places if we've actually felt them while we're painting them. It does seem rather a tall order if you haven't done this, but you just think about what all of those surfaces are made up, all these little tiny marks that suggest the vegetation that's on them. Some of it dry, some of it green, some of it yet to come out. It's not unknown for me to get this far and then decide to make this a picture of the Queensboro Bridge, but I'm not going to do that. So what I'm doing now is putting little tiny bits of form into this, so it isn't a flat mass. And they're very light marks without a whole lot of paint. And I'm barely touching this. Notice that still I haven't figured out, or maybe I haven't told you, but in fact I haven't figured out what kind of a day this is going to be. What kind of weather, what time of day. And at this stage I don't yet want to decide on that. I just want to keep developing these forms. And then I'm going to hang some light on it. If you think when you go to the museum you see paintings that are of specific places or aren't, you don't really know unless the museum label tells you that it's X place. But if the artist has done a really good job, you believe it as much as any place that you've read about or heard about. It becomes a real place, and it becomes just as real as those other places. Here, as you can see, sort of by accident, maybe slightly by intention, this face of this hill is quite rocky. And that's just a question of those random marks, which begin to suggest that there's no vegetation on that side. Yes, sir.
It says you began making compositional decisions that move your landscape to being believable. Aside from not letting mountains slide off the edges, the check mark in the foreground, what other personal guidelines were piloting your decisions?
I'm not sure this workshop cost enough to get that answer, but the answer is I constantly want to have lines, and particularly diagonals, that are working in unison and against each other to make a more active surface. I tried to find a place where if I were making a still life or anything else, that this spot right here might very well be my center of interest no matter what I was painting. And so I tried to find some place like that. You may recall we had a big tree there at some stage, and there have been some other things. And have everything, in fact, work in perspective this way into it to give us a sense of depth, but also to have all of these lines working against each other so that there's some dynamism just in those lines. Joe, when people like the answer, do they send you a thumbs up or something?
No, they don't.
That could be one of two things. Either they don't or they, or they didn't like the answer.
We did have somebody email us saying we're all okay with the blather. So.
Oh, that's nice. No doubt someone from Ireland.
Yeah.
In my head, most of the information that's necessary for me to believe this place is already here. I will intensify things and sublimate some other things, but I'm willing to believe it's a real place now. Anybody who wants to get in touch with Joe and tell me it doesn't look like a real place, we'll take your name and address and No, if you have suggestions about what I should do, I'm happy to hear them and then disregard them. Been thinking about doing a workshop in Ireland the beginning of this April. So it being that close, it's probably would count as a pop-up workshop. But I would like some people who don't mind wearing a jacket while they're painting because it's cool, but who are perhaps not beginners for this particular one, but people who really would like to confront this sort of a landscape. There's a place where we based the last Irish workshop called Westport in County Mayo. It's a great town and lots of pubs. One of the pubs is owned by a fellow named Mike Malloy, who is one of the members of the Chieftains. And so there's good music, there's lots of Guinness, there's lots of other beer. There's a good deal of fellowship and some just beautiful places to paint. That time of the year, it's a good deal less expensive. This Wyatt Hotel, which is in Westport, I just got a notice from them the other day that, and it's a really nice hotel, that in the very beginning of April, not including Fridays and Saturdays, but the rooms were in fact £40, and I think in season they're over £100, or euros, sorry, over 100 euros. So it's a great time to go in terms of a little economy. Normally my workshops are 9 days, and among the 9 days there's 6 days of actual instruction, there are 2 days off, and there's 1 day that we call a museum day if there's a museum within distance, or it's we go on some kind of a field trip. On the museum day, I take people around the museum and talk about the paintings that we find, many of which I've never seen before, so it's fun when we get to discover them together. And I find things in them that reinforce the lessons we've had during the workshop, but also things that as we continue with the workshop, we begin to look for in our own work and in the places where we paint. And for me, that's always fun. I had a particularly good time doing that. I did a workshop that was sort of in conjunction with the Academy of Realist Art in Toronto. And we went to a museum that had mostly a group of 7 Canadian painters in it. And we had a great time talking about those. In Holland, of course, we got to go to that other reasonable museum called the Rijksmuseum and to the Van Gogh Museum, so that was fun. I love talking about other people's paintings because I immediately see what they did well, and I occasionally see something where I thought they snoozed a little. And it's fun for students in particular to realize that sometimes great painters snooze. I'm not quite sure what's happening in there. So I keep going back to it and fussing with it. This value is a little dark for me, so instead of wiping it off, I'm going to lighten it by putting all these sgraffito marks in it, which bring up some of the panel in between and ultimately make it seem not so dark. It may seem tremendously tentative to you, especially if you are a painter who goes out and paints very directly with thick color. But it's the way I know, and I think particularly for people who are starting out, it's a lot less scary. I know it's less scary for me. during this last year, I've had some spots where I wasn't painting very much, and they brought home the thing that's always been true in my career. If I stop painting for a week and I go back to paint, I feel like I've never done it before. And as strange as that seems, it's just think, well, how do I make that color, or what do I do with this? It's, if that happens to you, you are not alone. Excuse me. I was given the coffee. I'm going to drink some of it. So.
We've actually had a question from Tim Giles. Not a question, but he's saying the scene looks an awful lot like many places out here in the West. I see a benefit in doing workshops out this way.
Thank you, Tim. Your check will be in the mail. The big, robust forms occur in lots of places. So what then distinguishes one place from another is generally a sense of the local color and the clarity of the light. In Ireland, there's often so much moisture in the air, even if it's not coming down on top of you, that everything becomes somewhat diffuse and somewhat muted. Whereas in the West, you can wind up with just crystalline skies that you don't often see in Ireland. This is the camera I don't like, the one that's over there. And I don't know how often that's on, but all this time I'm squinting. And so that I can get myself to almost see this as if I'm about 10 feet back.
A question.
Yeah.
Saying, would you give an example of what you mean when other painters snooze?
No, it would be very unkind if I did. But let me assure you, you can sometimes in the museum you can hear the snoring. We cannot all be at the top of our game, no matter how great we are, and that doesn't include me, but I mean artists generally. So sometimes there are places in paintings and great paintings where there are sections that sort of got mailed in. And one of our jobs as artists is not to disrespect the painter who's done that, but to see how, even in spite of that same failing that we probably have all the time, they managed to make something that's cohesive, strong, works all together. And our ability to pick at the fact that the wheelbarrow isn't drawn correctly or whatever is not much of an issue. When I first started painting, I was looking at Cézanne's still lifes, and I'm not over bright, but I knew that there was more than one point of view in these pictures, and I was really sort of troubled by that. Until I realized, with a little bit more maturity, that he was managing to show me a lot more about all of these objects by changing the point of view, and that it didn't matter that they weren't, in the strictest sense, all lying in the same plane all the time. That he told me a great deal of stuff about these that I wouldn't have gotten just from one view. It's one of the things that I was a little resistant to Van Gogh in the beginning, very much for the case that sometimes he was not scrupulous about his drawing. And although I spent a lot of time outside, sometimes I'd never quite seen those rotating stars. But again, as I thought about what he was trying to talk to me about, rather than whether or not I thought it was correct, I began to see that he was effectively telling me about stuff that I hadn't yet seen. When King Tut's tomb was discovered, the man who was furthest in, his name was Howard somebody, was asked, "What do you see?" And he said, "I see things, wonderful things." And if you look at someone like Van Gogh, who's been to places that we can't necessarily easily access, you realize that he has come back and shown us wonderful things. He's broadened our sense of visual delight and told us about other ways of looking at things. And that's the important part. It doesn't matter that the two railings are not parallel. Who cares? What matters is he's talked to us about stuff that he wants to show us. It's sort of like when I was little, at the end of the summer, there was always a requirement in school that we had to write a paper about what we'd done over our summer vacation. And when you go out painting in the field, if you're painting exactly what's there, or even if you're painting in the studio and you've managed to go someplace in your head like this, it's very much like those papers about showing people where you have been. Oh, it's just beautiful, isn't it?
Just so you know, Don, it's 2 hours into you got an hour left.
Okay, thank you. Sometimes young artists will say to me that they don't mind making the paintings, but they don't want to go to the opening, and they don't want to talk to Mr. and Mrs. Smith, and it's a waste of time, and they're artists after all, and they're precious, and they shouldn't have to do this. And that's probably entirely true, except Mr. and Mrs. Smith are guaranteeing that you've got something on your table next week, so it might be nice if you were a little more polite to them. But more importantly, you don't have to learn to engage with clients if you really like bartending or you really like waiting on table. But if you don't, then you need to learn how to do it. It's not hard. You'll generally find that people could not be more interested in what you have to say, and that they'll often give you some insights about your own work that you actually hadn't noticed and hadn't intended, but in fact are integral to what you've made. So don't necessarily out of hand say, oh, I can't do that, because you can. One time when I was feeling perhaps a little too big in my britches, I was at an opening and this woman said to me, well, how did you start painting? Why did you start painting? And I, without having thought about it too much, said to him, well, I actually wanted to prove my parents wrong. And they both looked incredibly horrified. And I said, actually, what that means is my parents told me that money doesn't grow on trees. And so I spent my life trying to show that that isn't true. It's a little too dark in there.
Had a suggestion from Sarah Brown, who's watching from England.
Pardon me?
Sarah Brown, who's watching from England, says it reminds her a lot of the Lake District. You must come to Yorkshire for a Rosemary workshop.
I had a little brief exchange with Simi about that. So Sarah, you work on that and I'll be there, okay? I can find all of the sentiments that you'll find in the Bronte sisters for you. It'll be great fun. So someone write down that Sarah Brown is in charge of this, okay? There is such an austere beauty in moorland and these kind of hills that I love, and it's certainly a quiet beauty. When I first started, I was very much interested in American tonalism. And in fact, there is now a new thing called the American Tonalist Society, which is having an exhibition at Salmagundi in May. It will be their first exhibition. And I've been invited to send something to that, and so I have to look and see what I have, or probably I shall have to make something. But I like the quiet quality of those paintings. Sometimes for me, paintings that are tremendously full of color, I find really exciting. And then my eyeballs get tired because they're so overstimulated by it. Whereas in tonalist paintings, I can keep going back and think about the subtlety and the mood that's in them. There are many sins committed under the name of tonalism, so one has to be careful to make sure that tonalism that you're looking at or being told is tonalism really is. but they're invariably quiet. Do I keep changing values? Yes. Am I sure that those are buildings or what they are? No. I don't want you to be scared about it. I'm driving this bus, you don't have to worry about it. For Sarah Brown, perhaps my favorite poem is Tintern Abbey by Lake District poet William Wordsworth, and I love it. There's a lot in there for artists, not descriptions, but words about the way in which experiences and impressions become part of us. With this line, I had to be very careful I don't wind up with a hammock, and it's a little hammocky at the moment. So I'm going to have this come down and have a little less of a line up the top there. Often when I'm doing this, in fact, I'm taking paint off, not putting it on. How much time do we have, Joe?
Just under 55 minutes.
Uh-huh. Well, that gives me plenty of time to ruin this, which is good. I think we might ask if anybody has any suggestions about what I do on this. And only polite suggestions, Joe, if you get it. Most brushes, if they have a somewhat pointed other end, have a built-in sparkle thing, which you can do just by scratching into that wet surface. This way, when I go to properly paint the water, there will be a little activity in it that I don't actually paint, that's somewhat at random. Don't like that line, the fact that it is a line, so we have to do something about that. Many places in the British Isles you'll find in out-of-the-way places there will be a plantation of softwood trees. And perhaps that can be that. I did threaten to my hosts here, who have been very good to me, that I would get this far and then turn it into a seascape. They told me I couldn't do that, so. All the while telling me I could do whatever I wanted, so go figure. I like this now being tucked behind here, and that's a little sense of something on the top of this little promontory. But I don't like the fact that this line is rising and seems to go up along that edge. So we're going to do this to get it to tuck behind. I hope that made sense. So what have we here? Stuff. I have to say, all those Hudson River School painters who were my early heroes, I still tremendously respect their achievement, but I sometimes think to myself, so lose all the leaves. I don't need to know that. And it just sometimes seems fussy to me, that I'm getting too much information. George Innes famously said that he discovered at a certain time that facts did not gain him meaning. And I think that's very true. Now, what might that be? I don't think we want it to be a caravan. Let's break it up a little bit. If I begin to think that there's some trees or something here, then I want to have a side and an underplane on them. I'll show the top by darkening this a little bit and letting the light of the tops of the trees be there, and we'll see if that works. They look sort of like trees to me now. This guy, the original one, is still here, though he keeps changing its shape. But shape-shifting really strikes me very much like the Irish countryside. My Irish friend says sometimes you get yourself in the middle of a field and you can't seem to get out because the fairies are doing something to you, that you take your jacket off and turn it inside out, and then you can get out of the field. So remember that if you're outside and you're having difficulties. So if I'm going to have this light part over here, then I want something on this hillock that is somewhat dark. It may not ultimately be this color I'm putting on here, but so that will contrast with what I do over here. If you are painting along with me and trying to do this and getting really annoyed because I keep changing it, it's, depending on where you live, it's probably time to go get a drink. Actually, it doesn't matter where you live, you can go get a drink. Go ahead. Painting is tremendously important to me. And I don't mean just my own work, but I mean painting generally. And part of why I tease so much is because it is so important to me. And sometimes I get really overwhelmed by how much I love it, how much what I'm doing falls short of what I wish it would be, how much I envy people, other people's work that seems so effortless, and yet I know, of course, that they've paid great costs in doing it. But it always sometimes seems like everybody else is getting from A to Z much faster than I am. But one of the great advantages I have is I'm much older than they are, so I will actually get to Z before them. Unlike most of you who are watching, I get pretty tired standing in front of the easel for 3 hours straight. But there's no union here, so I don't get a break. So you didn't get one person who said they believe it? Oh, it's terrible.
Well, the guy in the West.
Oh, that's true.
And the Yorkshire.
That's right. Okay, so I feel better. Okay. Well, that's, you know, out of 10,000, that's not bad, right? The color on this will particularly be fun tomorrow, because I'll have all of these marks over which I can lay opaque color, some transparent, but a lot of opaque, so that I begin to have many more layers in it than I would get if I painted it directly. Yes.
From Laurie Hallowell, she says, you mentioned earlier the distinction between an artist and a craftsman. I'm curious, when viewing painting, what indicates to you which camp the creator falls into?
I think I can tell almost immediately when I look at a painting. Paintings done by craftsmen, I always come away thinking that the artist wants me to know just how good he is or she is. Whereas paintings painted by artists, I generally come away having a pretty clear understanding of what they wanted me to think about. And it's usually not about how good they are. That's part of it. There are so many more skilled representational painters now than when I started, which was my luck, because I didn't have to go head to head with quite so many people at the time. But I would say that for most people, there's invariably somebody else who actually can do it better. But your advantage is that only you have your eyes and your sensibilities. And the other painter, no matter how well they paint, can't see with your eyes. And the important thing is what you want to talk to us about. And it's not necessarily about how perfectly shaped the tangerine is or whatever, but it's about something new that you want to tell us about surfaces or tangerines or whatever. But that's where the true gift, I think, lies. So you can see I keep softening and softening. I would like to think that after you do this initial part, even though I have put some color in it, if you take a black and white photo of it, when you look at it, it does not occur to you that the painting may not be in color. Because most of the information should be here except the local color. This is when I turn this into the Queensboro Bridge, right? Right here, I wanted something dark. So I'll put a dark mark in there and stare at it a bit and see if I can make it into something that makes sense to be there, that's dark. Although there's not much paint on this canvas, my brush has just about not stopped the whole time we've been here. Sometimes putting it on, sometimes taking it off. But I'm just trying to get all these subtle relationships down. You guys probably can't hear it, but there's some noises in here from the peanut gallery that are very distracting. So let's have a little reflection of this bank here. These sort of sandy bits here, I think of as sandy, are not going to be quite so much like roads. They're going to have a little more variety in them ultimately, I think. How do I know where that reflection is? Well, I sort of know. I remember learning in school the angle of reflection equals, the angle of incidence equals the angle of reflection. And I understood that imperfectly then and even less perfectly now, but I'm sure that's doing that. It's interesting that these 2 points here become rather a gate to this. That may be a good thing or a bad thing, and I'll think about that over the night.
Question. How many actual brushes are you using?
2 since the beginning. The stubby one and the more proper rosemary brush.
Okay, we got a good question from Tammy Gilchrist.
In Italian, did you say?
Tammy Gilchrist.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that Tammy spoke Italian, but go ahead.
She asks, for imaginary works, when a potential collector asks the question, where is this? How do you answer?
Can you tell me if there's a bar? Most of my collectors, if they know anything about me, don't necessarily expect it to be a real place. I can usually say without really lying that it is, I could say that this is Ireland and it's as close to Ireland as any Irish painting I've painted. And so in that sense, it's all informed by Ireland. It does get a little difficult. You'll have to work out your own strategy. But you can use that Melville quote about the fact it's not down on any map, true places never are. That will stop a lot of the questions. But I just try to avoid it. And it's not usually said to me. It's usually said to a dealer, so I don't really have to answer it. But I'm not a travel guide. I'm trying to make paintings, and I'm trying to make paintings that talk about a kind of light or a season or certain sorts of shapes. And I guess maybe I'm trying to convince people that where it is doesn't matter, that it's to some extent their hang-up. You can't really say to Mrs. Smith, you know, that's your hang-up, Mrs. Smith. That doesn't usually go over well. But it's important to try and get people to realize is that we're making paintings. And it's we look at paintings by some, let's say, some obscure English painter of the Lake District. And right here at the moment in North Carolina, we have no idea if it really looks like that or not, but we accept the premise. And we're interested in the place. And it doesn't really matter that, you know, wherever this particular village was along the lake isn't there in the painting. It doesn't matter. If the thing works in terms of its light, in terms of its mood, that's all that counts, at least for me. So if Mrs. Smith bothers you, you just send her to me, okay? I'll set her straight.
We've had somebody else who says they do believe it, and it also looks like somewhere in the West.
Ah, well, see, look at that. So much for the Lake District. There's an awful lot of vegetation in this for the West, though, I think.
We've had a question from Sheila Horvitz, who says, do you ever start a painting with a thumbnail or drawing on a paper to work out sculptural form and shapes? And if not, is it because the liquid lets you move paint around?
I don't usually do it. I think the latter is true. I might look at an old sketchbook that gives me an idea, but I don't really work out the composition at that moment. And so I think it's the fact that I can keep playing with this, as long as it's thin, enables me to keep monkeying with it, and I can try out more things and reject them or accept them over a few hours than I'm ever likely to make that many thumbnail sketches. Plus, if I'm making a thumbnail sketch, it's true that what works that size should work well this size, or that this size should work for a 30-46 painting, but it's not always true. Not every painting can be the same painting, just made larger. I usually, because I'm talking to you guys, I'm not doing it so much, but often when I'm painting myself, I make up some sort of narrative about what took place in this locality. And they're all very, you know, crazy things, but, you know, like the place where somebody was found after they'd been missing or whatever. And it often keeps me from thinking too hard about the marks I'm making with the left side of my brain, so I can just go ahead and paint. Historically, I've painted a lot listening to books on tape. And I find that very helpful because it helps me get out of my own way. One of the things you can think about here, and it's true in almost every kind of painting, when I'm doing these things on this far bank over here, I'm trying to alternate lights against darks. So we have a light tree, a dark space, that light, whatever it is, a slightly darker thing, a lighter tree, a dark space. And as long as the intervals are not the same, it's not so apparent what you're doing. I mean, in one sense, you talk about telling the truth, we are taking dirt, mixed with colored dirt, of course, but dirt nonetheless, mixed with oil, and smearing it on this piece of fabric with sticks that have animal hairs on the end, or maybe not animal hairs, and the whole thing is patently absurd. So if you start from that premise, everything you manage to accomplish, every time you convince somebody that this is a mountain or that's a field or whatever, is a tremendous triumph. And so maybe you haven't done it as well as the best person who's ever done it like that, but it's amazing that you've done it at all. Remember that. That's the sparkle end again. Tim, if you're still listening, maybe you could tell me where in the West this is, and I'll call it that.
About 30 minutes left.
30? Thank you. I wish it were 3 hours more today. So what are we going to do with our 30 minutes? The problem is at this stage, I have to start making some decisions, and I've been holding off on doing that. But let's put some marks down. And I often, in a demonstration, I want to go like this and say, I'm sure to get an idea in a minute. But now, of course, I really have to make decisions and hold to them. And because I so enjoy the period when it's all fluid, it's hard for me to do that. But that is some kind of group of trees right there. And this is the reflection of those trees. I've never really painted in the West, and I remember a story about Edward Hopper going there with his wife, and he couldn't cope with the colors, and so while she painted whatever she was painting, he went down to the rail yard and painted the boxcars, because they were just the same as they were back east. Place that was very important to me starting out was just half a day that I had along the river Dordogne in the Périgord, and subsequently went back there a lot. But that particular day, something clicked, and I was there from like 9 in the morning till about 1 in the afternoon, having to, in fact, get to Brussels in a hurry, and so I couldn't stay any longer. But I think that particular morning was tremendously important to me, and it was partly because I had been for a month in Provence, and although I loved looking at it, I didn't as much enjoy painting it, and I had not been a painter for terribly long. It was very hard for me to all of a sudden change the nature of my color palette and to deal with this. And the sun was relentless, and I'm fair-skinned, and my eyes are light, and so I'm sure I didn't have sunglasses, and I'm sure that troubled me. Plus there was the Mistral. And so when I was coming back up and wound up spending this time in the Dordogne at the suggestion of a friend of mine, all of a sudden all the trees were relatively blue-green, and I felt like, oh, I understand this. I didn't have time to paint, but I drew a lot, and I painted from those drawings when I got back. They were not very complete drawings, but it was the sense of this very verdant place after the austerity and aridity of where I was in Provence. now I would enjoy painting Provence because I might even bring something close to the right kind of colors. What I was just thinking about there is I was just thinking this could be a tree, but, and it's wider than it is tall, so it could certainly be an old apple tree, but I don't think there would be an old apple tree there. So, we could call it Johnny Appleseed's home place. And then when Mrs. Smith asks, you say, oh, it's a picture of where Johnny Appleseed was born.
Somebody said, or Darla McDowell has said, somewhere along the Flathead River in Montana, I expect a moose to come out and graze along the water's edge.
Ah, the moon indeed. That's perhaps when I should say, where is it that I should wait to receive the check, or not the check, the ticket you're sending me to come out there and see that?
We've also had somebody say Utah and now South Carolina.
Well, usually South Carolina and Utah come up in the same breath. But see, I mean, there's the perfect example about people bring to it what they know. I have been to Asheville, which could not be more different than where we are here in Raleigh. And Asheville does not remind me of Utah. Okay, we got values, we have shape, we have a little bit of color. We have one very tired instructor. Those of you who know me know how much I did not want to be in front of the camera, and it was only not a problem in those 20 minutes I seemed to sleep last night thinking about this. But it's been very nice people not to send rude questions or make rude remarks. I think that's very respectful. No doubt by tomorrow people will be emboldened. What do you think over here, Joe? I think that checkmark thing is going to go down there. One of my hallmark things. And then we'll see how we'll redesign it. One thing you'll probably find tomorrow is that there are going to be some fields up here, rather rough fields. We were on Achill Island for several days in County Mayo for last April's workshop, and among other things there was this deserted village where the gable ends of the buildings were still there, sometimes a little bit more, some little enclosures from them, and it was a village in which the famine struck, and it wound up that ultimately there was no one in the village, and it's a very sad place, but hauntingly beautiful at the same time. So I want this bank to have a top. So I'm going to do that not by lightening it, but by darkening what's behind it. See, if I were a good Western painter, I'd put some aspens in here, but I don't know that I can do that. I could pretend they were white birches, but they don't grow in big amounts like aspens do. And how will I ever get that workshop from Rosemary Brushes if I'm painting Montana? So. What is that? I don't know. You should probably remember when you're looking at paintings, particularly in museums, that what you're seeing that seems so intentional may not originally have been so. It may be a happy accident that the artist noticed. Let's make a field for tomorrow. Do I have time to make a field?
You've got 20 minutes.
Oh, good. That's plenty of time for a field. This won't be this low in or high in value, but
Can you just take a step to your right?
yes.
I can see that. Thank you.
Doesn't matter if I can see it, right? Okay. I mean, it's been rather clear that I haven't been able to see it all day, right? So that's there to remind us that tomorrow we're going to put a field back there. And the question then is, will I see a reflection of that field? And I don't think so. But of course, we could always fudge it because nobody's really going to question it. But we're not going to fudge it today. We'll sleep on that one. Here's a lighter tree for you. But I think it's going to be fun. And I get to decide what's fun and what isn't. I think we're going to have a tree here. And if this is not, this is a little piece of scrunched up paper towel. And this tree is going to go, but not that fat in the middle, but for now he can be like that. And he may get some friends, we'll see, but he's a little tall. Let's see, now we're going to fix him. He has to be very skinny. This gives me a chance to tell you about the fact that things that are light colored are particularly light colored when they pass in front of dark things, such as this back here. If this were coming up to the sky, it would keep going, and right up here the trunks would become dark, and the leaves would become dark against the sky because the sky is so much brighter. I'm not sure this tree will stay here quite like this. I like the bottom part, so let's get rid of that. The ability to erase with this method is really good if you're somebody like me who doesn't get the correct answer the first time. I kind of like the shape of the bottom part of that. Well, there we have a tree. It's hard to see the foliage up here. When we get some color in it, that'll be a little bit easier. we want to make sure that this far bank in here is a little bit darker in places, just to set off that trunk. At this stage, I'm beginning to think about how I'm going to light this, what time of the day, and all that sort of thing. But I'm not going to tell you because you won't come back tomorrow. So, but tomorrow we'll figure that out. But I'm already thinking about it. That little shadow gives you some idea of where the light might come from. Even though it's not really a shadow, it's just a little line. Maybe if I do this and let this guy have a dark side, it becomes harder not to tell you what's happening. And it may not stay this way. I think this is going to be a different kind of bush. And it's going to break that line in the back there. This is a very good tool. If you work in cadmium colors or flake white, I do use flake white, you might not want to do this, or you might not want to at least eat your sandwich immediately afterwards. You can do it for a few years. I'm probably okay now. I could probably have it all over my sandwich, and at the end would be the same. I know I have some friends from my studio building in Massachusetts watching this, and I'd like to commend them for having been kind and not made wise remarks to me. So I did not make leaves or masses of foliage, but I did break up that in the back there, which gives a little bit of the suggestion of that, and we'll see what we do with that tomorrow. Right, this line right here, can you see that? Part of me wants to figure out how to make that into a tree, but it can't be on the way back part over there because it's much too big. And to get it to come all the way around to be where it could be in the ground here isn't going to work. So we'll just get rid of him for now, so he doesn't distract me. This tree that we made here, it's either got to be by itself or one of three. And like when I was little, the reason for that is because I said so. I was always hearing that. So now we have the Flathead River that passes through South Carolina on its way to the Lake District. It doesn't matter if we can make a convincing place. Those of you who are actually paying attention will see that, in fact, I'm starting to light this. I'm giving light and dark sides to some things. I don't mind this value, but that blue is a little insistent. So put a little burnt umber into it. That's my heart monitor, if you can hear it. This has taken a long time, and probably a lot longer than you guys are willing to devote to this. But it will make everything I do tomorrow so much easier because I've made most of the important decisions. And so now, although it seems funny to say it, now I can just paint it. And there's nothing worse than when you finally paint the best tree you've ever painted and it's 3 inches to the left in the wrong place. And you have to wipe it out. It's one of the hardest things of all. This probably shows you why I feel so strongly that values do all the work and color gets the credit. Because you know most of the important things about this place just from these lights and darks.
Donna, we've got about 10 minutes left.
It's much too long.
If anybody's
If anyone's still there.
If anyone's got any questions, you've got 10 minutes.
Okay. For the question that hasn't been asked, yes, I am dreaming of a Guinness. Isn't it nice that no one is actually still awake? The more I introduce this color down at the bottom, the cooler and bluer this gets, even though the color itself hasn't changed. Maybe we can do this. This will be fun. We could do a... That's going to have to be paint. Unfortunately, that's very dry down there, so I can't make the reflection of that tree. And I had to figure out, I said I was going to do something about these sort of beach things, wasn't I? That's where that stuff grew down there after that big flood. You remember the one.
Someone's just submitted a question. Not necessarily a question, but they've just said, "Thank you, love your demo and approach. It's just believable. So now go treat yourself to a locally brewed beer."
Well, actually, unfortunately, I want something brewed in Dublin, but thank you.
Another question from Thorpe. Do you consider Jamie Wyeth more of a craftsman or of an artist, or both?
Can I plead the Fifth Amendment for that? He's a good craftsman. Do I think necessarily we would know as much about him if it weren't for his grandfather and his father? I think perhaps not. I respect what he does. Do I love it? Not necessarily. Do I occasionally like pictures? Yes. So please don't pass that on to him. Was that submitted by Jamie Wyeth?
Yeah, it was.
And finally, probably a good one to end on. I've wanted to see this since I discovered Donald's work, learning so much. Perfect amount of blather. Thank you, Donald. Andy Stokes, please get this man a Guinness.
Thank you very much. And I will see all of you folks tomorrow, or you'll see me. But I'm believing you're out there, both of you. And I like the fact that when you do the questions, you keep changing your name to make it seem as though there are more of you. I think that's very nice. And you can bet I'll be into the Guinness. So thank you. I think it'll stay at this stage until we're done, until tomorrow. And this will all be dry. And hopefully we'll make some magic tomorrow.